understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is time for the podcast. John has reminded me that it's this time of year against the pollen count.
Pollen count is up.
Those of us, the sort of fair complexion tend, I think, it's an observation of mine, maybe not medically grounded, but people with kind of fair,
No, it's not.
we've got very bad respiratory systems.
Yeah.
We're always getting stuffed up and clogged up, and I've got really bad hay fever. And
Well,
all that
I
kind of
always think that hay fever is awful. I get a little bit, you get it quite bad.
Yeah.
But it's a real weird evolutionary quirk, isn't it?
Yeah, like why we get it.
Yeah.
And why it persists.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
exactly.
I think so. John and I are here studying evolutionary biology and the human experience and discussing hay fever and other such things. And then, of course, John just tells me that, before I come out to offer my little pearls of wisdom on the podcast, you can blow your nose. Anyway, how are you doing there? I hope you are not suffering from hay fever, as I am. And I hope you're enjoying the beautiful late June weather in Ireland, which is uncharacteristic. It may well have disappeared by the time this podcast gets onto you.
Do you know where I was this morning?
Where were you?
Well, early this morning, my beautiful wife decided...
That's very uncharacteristic.
Well, exactly.
You never get out of the scratcher.
But she got up at 7 o'clock and decided that she wanted to go for a sea swim and all the rest.
Oh, my God.
So I went, okay, I'll go with you. And I went down. The tide was out, unfortunately. But she got in down the 40 foot. And I went rock pooling. Something I haven't done since I was about, 10 or 12. And it was magical. I swear to God, it was fabulous. I was digging up sea urchins and crabs and stuff.
What? Down at Sandy Cove
on a Monday morning.
That's bizarre.
Oh, it was great. I was in my element, I have to say.
You were in rock pools.
Yes.
Looking for limpets
I was.
and mussels and all sorts of
little shrimp. Yeah,
little shrimp. Well, that's interesting. But you would have, if you were down the 40 foot, you would have looked over at the early morning Dublin skyline. You would have seen the pigeon house. And you would have been able to make out, particularly if you got up in a little bit of a height at Sandy Cove, okay?
Yeah.
You would have been able to make out the skyline of the city. And the skyline of the city is still, John, dotted with cranes.
Yes, it
at
is.
a time,
yeah.
but that is a really pathetic and rather vulnerable sign at a time when the commercial property market, as we've spoken about, has fallen by 27% since the end of COVID.
Wow.
Right? That's an extraordinary figure, right? The city is full, like lots and lots of other cities, full of empty buildings. And the reason you know that estate agents are worried is they flip the spin over to now tenants are in control. So it's always a good story.
Right, yeah.
It doesn't matter what it is. The market's going up or down or up and down. And most worryingly, John, the Central Bank of Ireland, that incredibly prescient organisation that I used to work for, that has never once predicted anything in the economy accurately, are now saying, don't worry, there is a slump in commercial property, but it's going to be contained.
Right.
That's always worrying. They themselves, the Central Bank of Ireland, and think about this, these are the people in charge of the finance of the economy, have written down the value of its own new offices in Dublin's North Docklands by 157 million a year after they moved into it at a cost of 220 million to buy and fit it out.
You're joking.
I swear to God.
This is the gold-clad building.
This is the gold. Yeah, exactly. This is
It's beautiful. I was in there, actually. It's beautiful.
It is a gold-clad building.
Yeah.
But as a contrary indicator, always bet against the central bank. The Fed in America is the opposite. So the Americans have an expression which is don't bet against the Fed, because the Fed has got the firepower, right? But in Ireland, I always think the pronouncements of the central bank should be taken as a counter-cyclical indicator. So you do the opposite of what they're saying.
But
right?
do you bet for or against the ECB then? Because they're the boys with the power here.
Because the ECB are the people with the firepower, right? So you never bet against them. As we were talking about the other day in France, when, for example, the ECB and Philip Lane and those guys want to affect a bond market, they can, because they print the stuff. But our crowd are only like a sub-post office.
Yeah.
I mean, because they can't print the money.
like every other central bank in Europe.
So they're just proffering opinions on the way the economy should materialize.
So, but hang on a second. This is the central bank devaluing their building by 157 million.
A year after they moved in.
A year after they moved in. But I thought, now I know that there's a whole shift in working over the last few years to a lot more remote working, but an awful lot of companies I'm hearing are demanding that their people come back into the office.
Yeah.
So therefore, surely the demand for office space would be, flatlining, if not on the increase.
Yeah, I mean, it should be. So basically the demand for people to come back has been marketed as we work better in teams and collaboration when we work together.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, the underlying reality is they have to boost up the rents, the yields.
Yeah.
They have to boost up office take-up because they are aware that there's this massive big overhang, right? So this is, again, comes down to what we spoke about the other day about confidence, right?
Yeah.
It's that there is no precise metric that if I get 100 workers to come back in, that'll boost up the yield to a certain level and that'll stabilize the market. Once confidence goes, confidence is this notion that it's, can be affected by interest rates.
Yeah.
It can be affected by perception of the future. It can be affected by political, economic upheaval, et cetera, et cetera. But once it goes, and once you become aware that more people are exposed to a market than want to actually play in that market, confidence disappears. And then what happens is buyers, they disappear. Sellers then try and create all sorts of stories to suggest, oh, don't worry, the price is going to be fine. It's going to stay up here.
Yeah.
And that's where we are now. So I'm going to do commercial property, not just in Dublin, but worldwide. I'm going to relate it to the opening up of the West in America. I'm going to relate it to a flatboat episode. I'm also going to relate it to Mark Twain. And we're going to end up back in commercial property 2024. And of course, what I want to talk about today is the expression to be sold down the river. Now, we know that to be sold down the river is a expression that people who have been basically hoodwinked.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I want to tell you where it came from.
Yes.
I want to tell you why commercial property shifts in big, big demographic ways and what we can learn from Mark Twain and an unusual history of the United States. And we'll come all the way back from Mississippi in the mid-19th century back to the centre of Dublin in 2024.
Settle in, everyone.
Settle in. You know the way you're always saying to me, James Mack, will you ever stop reading? Right?
Actually, no.
Not stop reading, but how come you're reading all the time?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I'm reading at the moment a fantastic book that I just got in an airport, in Philadelphia Airport, the other day, by a guy called, isn't this a great American name, Rinker Book?
Hey,
Rinker! Exactly. And Rinker Book has written a book called Life on the Mississippi, an epic American adventure, right?
Right.
And I'm always very interested in American history, American economic history, simply because it is fascinating. And what you also find, and you always find, we're talking about commercial property worldwide, is that although it's always a function of the economic and credit cycle, at the beginning of the economic and credit cycle, there's always something fundamental that changes, something real, right? This is what Minsky and Kindleberger, the two great gods of economic cycles, always said there is a moment which they called displacement. Something is displaced, we start, and from there we move, right?
Yeah.
And I was thinking of this in the context of commercial property, but in the context of the book that I'm reading by Rinker Book, right? Which is a history of the Mississippi, right? And what he has done, it's a great, great book, right?
Yeah.
What he's done, he goes back to what is an unheralded adventure, a part of American history, economic history, called the flatboat era. And flatboats were...
Give us a
so about
date.
1790 to 1820 or 1830.
Okay,
right. So we're going
early
back
days.
a long, long time. We're going to start with a character, John, right?
Right.
Called Jakob Yonder, a Swiss-German farmer from Reading, Pennsylvania. The year is 1782, right? So if you look at the map of America, right?
Yeah.
You see that Pennsylvania, West Virginia are probably as far west as most Americans ever went, white Americans I'm talking about, up until the Revolution.
And what is that? That's about 500 miles, is it?
It's about...
From New York?
Yeah, about that.
About that.
Yeah, about that. Maybe a bit more, but not that far, right? And our friend Jakob decides that he is going to navigate on his own homemade barge, right? He's going to navigate two of the great rivers of the United States, the Ohio River and, of course, the mother of them all, the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
And in so doing, he is going to reduce profoundly his transport costs out to the Atlantic at New Orleans, right? And of course, by doing that, he will then not have to go all the way from Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, all the way to Philadelphia in a cart and then pay very high charges to get his stuff out. So if we imagine that the huge fulcrum of trade at the time in North America was between the Caribbean and North America, right?
Yeah.
So the Caribbean produced sugar in huge amounts, coffee, right, in huge amounts, right? That were the two major products, right? And cotton. Okay?
Yeah.
And all of these drove the Caribbean economy, all on the bedrock of slavery.
Yeah.
And of course, what came out of the north of America was grain and salted pork, both of which were used to feed the slaves in the Caribbean. Okay. And of course, whiskey and the big one, of course, was furs, pelts,
Yes, of
which
course.
were exported to Europe.
Yeah.
So that was the sort of trading thing. And what typically you had to do is you had to get them all across the east to the East Coast, and then out on ships in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, right?
Which must have been a horrendous journey.
Horrendous. There's no roads in America.
Yeah.
There's no roads at all. I mean, in Europe, you had roads which had been built since the Romans, number one. But then after the Romans, you had a road system that was built on pilgrimages. So you had roads going all over Europe. You had none of this in America. None of this.
And this is also a heavily forested area.
Well, in fact, you will love it because you love nature. Some of the descriptions of the notes taken by people who actually built these flatboats of extraordinary verdant nature. And the thousands of animals and these flocks of birds that would just darken the sky. There were so many. So America was this, this unsettled territory, except for the Native Americans.
Yes.
Who I'll come on to, right?
Yeah.
So Jacob Yonder.
Come on, Jacob.
Jacob makes this thing, makes his own barge and goes down, navigates these huge rivers, right? Gets out at New Orleans, right?
Yeah.
At a place which was made famous called the Lake of Pontchartrain. And I don't know if you know anything about this song.
I absolutely do.
Now,
I love that song.
Right, okay. And who made famous by?
Well, there was quite a few versions of it. One was Christy Moore, obviously.
Yeah. Dylan
did a version of it. Dylan did a version of all these. So
and do you know who the great one was? Brian Cowan.
Brian Cowan, of course.
Brian Cowan, the Lake of Pontchartrain. We're going to talk about the Lake of Pontchartrain.
And actually, and one other version, which is actually possibly one of my favorite versions, is Liam O'Malley.
Well, maybe we'll play that today if we can. Liam, will you give us the
nod?
Give us the nod. Okay, so it's the Lake of Pontchartrain. Right? The Lake of Pontchartrain is right down there in the Mississippi Delta, right down at. Okay. Which is about an Irish fella.
Yeah.
Who fancies and falls in love with a Native American woman, and he wants to marry her, but she is betrothed to somebody else.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so we're going all over the house.
Beautiful melody.
But let's come back. I want to come back to the original idea that all economic cycles begin with a displacement moment, that the society changes.
Yeah.
So what happened was this flatbed era was this extraordinary event where Americans started building their own boats. And when Jacob came back to Pennsylvania and said, I've just made a fortune by bringing all our stuff, pelts and everything down the other way, all the Pennsylvania farmers said, we're in. And of course, what the other huge export was timber because of all the woods in America. So basically, what happened was, in a very short period, in 1790, so just revolutionary times, okay, only 3% of Americans lived to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. By 1820, think about it, 30% of Americans. So you had this massive demographic shift in the United States. And of course, it all came from navigating these great rivers. And of course, what happened is all these settlers come down, they clear the land.
Were these new settlers coming in, or the settlers that were already there?
Settlers were already there, and then the other ones come in. Then our Lakes of Pontchartrain guys come in, right?
Yeah.
Okay, they were mainly Ulster Scots. right?
Right.
People from Antrim, people from Fermanagh, people from County Down,
Yeah.
who were the first Irish settlers in the
Yeah.
United States.
These
Right?
are the hillbillies.
These are the hillbillies,
Yeah.
exactly. The
Yeah.
followers of King Billy from the hills.
Yeah.
And those hills were the Appalachian Mountains. So they were really, really, they were regarded as quite backward
Yeah.
by the more sophisticated.
Still are.
Well, that's probably true. Never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But what I found fascinating about this book was the fact that this is underreported and it profoundly changed the Americans in many ways. One of which it is thought that level of kind of getting up and leaving. Don't the Americans have a restless nature? Like if you meet an American family, the chances are they've lived in 4 or 5 states.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah,
we Europeans don't do that. Well, Irish people are quite different, right?
Yeah.
But Europeans in general don't do that. But the second thing, of course, is it opened up the entire southwest of the United States. It created the extraordinary, vibrant culture of Louisiana. New Orleans was the city. The reason that New Orleans became such a huge city was because of this trade on the Mississippi River and the Ohio River. But of course, what it did for white Americans was open up possibilities. What it did for Native Americans is it destroyed them. Because the Native Americans were the people who originally lived on the rivers,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
And when the whites arrived, they cleared all the forests. And so the Native Americans' ability to hunt and gather and to hunt and trade and to hunt bison and buffalo and whatever, right? Because it totally destroyed. And then Andrew Jackson,
Yeah.
an Irish-American president, we don't like to think of him as Irish-American, he's born
Was he?
in
I actually-
County Down.
I didn't
Whereas
realize.
people were born in County
Right,
Down,
okay.
right?
Yeah.
Okay. Jackson had an act think about this, an act in the American Parliament called the Indian Removal Act, where they removed Indians, thousands and thousands and thousands of Native Americans were just uprooted and dropped in reservations to the west of the Mississippi. And they were the poor people who had to then fight the next wave of pioneers who came out. So it's all about that. This is a fascinating story of economics, but it's an extraordinary story about the displacement of Native Americans. You're going to say something about Jackson?
No, I was just going to say, just a passing comment, that he was also one of Trump's heroes. One of Trump's favorite presidents.
Was he?
Which makes perfect sense.
But there's also another very dark side to this, which is, do you know the expression to be sold down the river?
Yes.
Right? So to be sold down the river, we mean to be betrayed. We mean it's usually in financial terms. So you actually invest in something only to have second thoughts when you realize you've been misled. Somebody sold you down the river. But the original, this is the awful thing, the original expression, be sold down the river, comes from slavery. So what happened was, as these huge states open up in the United States, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, right? There is a shift in the American economy away from tobacco to cotton, because cotton is much more valuable, right?
Yeah.
So the original tobacco plantations of places like, let's say, Virginia, suddenly it became far more profitable to deploy slaves, to use slaves in the new cotton plantations of Mississippi and Louisiana and Arkansas, right? So to be sold down the river was literally, the slaves were promised a better life in these new plantations in order for the slaves to move in a more orderly fashion, right? Even though they were still slaves, the whites, the cynical whites who actually the slave owners understood the psychology. And they said, look, don't worry, we're going to this new life. And they were thinking, look, nothing could be worse than the tobacco plantations of West Virginia. They were wrong. They were actually sold. They were marched. Imagine this, they were marched from West Virginia in what was called coffle lines, C-O-F-F-L-E. And they were chains from one neck brace to another. You've seen them, right?
Yeah.
They were marched to the Ohio River from West Virginia, but they were told they were going to a better life, right? So psychologically, slave families moved, even though the slave men were being marched, slave families moved willingly. And they were sold down the river by slave traders to the extraordinary, nasty cotton plantations. And the reason they were more nasty was that they realized, the white slave owners realized that cotton could be produced. And if you could produce it, you could make a fortune.
Yeah.
So they introduced, can you imagine this? Quotas for each slave. And if you didn't make your quota of picking cotton, imagine this for a black man and black woman, right? You were beaten and whipped and murdered. So to be sold down the river is when you expect one thing and the outcome is completely different.
Yeah.
We now know that for finance, but it actually started with slaves being sold. And it's funny, when you're in America, I don't know if you feel this, but I'm always aware of slavery. It seems to me to be part and parcel of the American fabric. And our friend Andrew Jackson, who is from Antrim, imagine that his parents emigrated from Antrim.
Yeah.
Trump's friend, who's also on one of the American dollar bills, I can't remember which one it is, added fuel to the fire by removing Indians in a thing called the Indian Removal Act, right?
That is
It's
incredible.
extraordinary,
Yeah,
right?
it is.
But now another factor is, right, when you move so many people, willingly or unwillingly, what you actually need is a banking system, right?
Yeah.
And the Americans didn't have a banking system in this new territory in the Southwest, right? So when you move 3% of your population to becomes 30%, it's a free-for-all. And what happened then was the American banking system emerges, which was called wildcat banking, right?
Right.
And we always think wildcat strikes,
Yeah.
right? Because that's the word. Right? But wildcat banking was when banks were just emerging all over the place. And there were these moms and pops banks, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
just
basically,
private banking.
private banking. So this comes on to our monetary theory, right?
Yeah.
So the private banking that's set up there, every bank could issue its own currency. So you could actually set up the John Davis Bank, right? And I'd say, here, John, that's fine. And you'd say, don't worry, Macker, deposit your money, right? You deposit the money, right? I deposit my money in John Davis. John Davis figured out after a while, wow, this is really interesting. David McWilliams deposited $100 with me, but he's never asked for it back.
Yeah.
So he's kept it at safekeeping. What happens if I issue John Davis currency against the David McWilliams deposit, right? And if he doesn't, this is called fractional reserve banking.
Yeah.
If he doesn't ask for it all back, and let's say I keep maybe 10% of it, so if he turns up, that means I can lend 90% of David McWilliams' money to somebody else. And as long as the system keeps going, the John Davis currency is going to keep its face value, right? And of course, what happened was John Davis got a bit greedy. Okay. And
As he do.
As he do. And he said, look, if Dave McWilliams isn't coming in looking for his money and Jean-Michel Leroux isn't looking for his money and la, 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 I'm sitting on a gold mine here. So John Davis started to issue his own script, right?
Right.
And in that area, in that city, in that town, wherever it was, John Davis currency became accepted.
Yeah.
And as long as everyone accepted it, was fine. But of course, there comes a moment when Dave McWilliams says,
John, oh my God, here he comes.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not here. Do you remember that expression, gobshite in the house?
Yeah.
From
Jinx Lennon.
From Jinx Lennon. Shout out to Jinx Lennon, gobshite in the house. Well, it's a gobshite in the house moment where a gobshite comes to the door and everybody goes, oh man, it's him. It's Uncle Tony the gobshite, right? So I'm turning back up. I'm the gobshite turning back up to get my money back. And of course, what happens is you don't have the money because you've lent it out to everybody else. And you're trying to prevaricate. Then I go to the pub, the tavern, and I say to my friend, Arthur, if I were you, I'd take my money out of the John Davis Bank. He couldn't give me back. And you have a bank run.
Yes.
Right? And therefore, what happened was...
And I'm gone in the middle of the night.
They're gone in the middle of the night, exactly. And the saloon door is open and the sheriff is looking for you. This all happens, though. This is the fascinating thing.
Yeah.
And of course, from there, to be sold down the river, which was an expression for black slaves, becomes an expression of being hoodwinked. Or not so much hoodwinked, but investing in something you think is going to work for years and years and years, and you trust, only to realize that it was all just sales patter are part of a story. But the original dislocation was real. The original navigation of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers changed the United States profoundly for good and ill. But the end game was a financial speculation which destroyed huge parts of the United States, which is why after the American Civil War, the United States decided nobody else can ever issue their own script. And that's when they issued the dollar for the first time, the paper dollar.
Right.
They said, we are not having that, backed by gold.
But I was going to say, because everything else was backed by nothing, only Dave McWilliams $100.
For his $100.
But hang on, Michael, just think, what about the Mark Twain bit and commercial property?
Okay, so we got to get back. So Mark Twain, everyone thinks that the Mississippi River was navigated by steamboats.
Right.
Because Mark Twain went in 1882 on a 1-month trip. But he was well after the real thing.
Because there weren't steamboats at that stage.
Yeah, but back in the other one, these were navigated. These were sailboats.
Right.
Made up barges. And then once they arrived at their places, they actually took the sailboats, they chopped them back into and made little wooden houses out of them. So this is the whole thing. So Mark Twain was just, all I'm saying is he was just out by about half a century from the story. Commercial property, I will explain the link now, but should we get paid?
We may as well.
Not in John Davis currency, please.
So, commercial property. How is this all linked? Bring it together for me.
So it's all linked in the following way, right? What basically happened in the great flatboat era of the United States was that there was a technological change, which is these boats. There was a new market, which were these rivers. There were new products, right? All of which created an effervescence, all of which created an expectation that the world was going to be cool and dandy for 20 years. What actually happened was constant little crises in finance, okay? Now, think about the commercial property now. Those glittering buildings in Toronto, in London, in Dublin, in New York, in San Francisco, all of those were based on a profound change in technology, which was going to have long-term ramifications for the way in which the world worked. The tech stocks, therefore, the people who were leveraged onto this, were harnessed onto this, tech companies, they saw their stock rise dramatically.
Yeah.
As your stock rises dramatically, you use it as currency. And by that, I mean those large tech companies looked at their stock prices, saw that as wealth, went to the banking system and says, I'd like to buy, let's say, this very, very swanky piece of real estate.
Yeah.
The banking system would say, well, will you give me euros? They say, no, what we'll do is we'll pledge collateral. And our collateral will be our stock price.
Yeah.
And then you lend us. So in that way, the banking system gets on the hook, right? So everybody is now leveraged against the stock price of Apple or Facebook or whatever. Then the banks signal to developers, look, there's loads of money around.
Yeah.
Developers go, oh, fuck it. Let's build really expensive stuff.
Yeah.
At very, very, very high rents.
As much glass, as much steel.
As you possibly can see. Exactly. Right? And then, of course, pension funds say, oh, look at this. Those really, really high-end companies.
They look secure.
Yeah. Exactly, because their share price is really, really high.
Yeah.
So why don't we take our pension funds and give it to the commercial property grifters, salespeople, and they will guarantee us a 4% yield for the rest of the world. And why is that good? Because interest rates are so low.
Yeah.
So when interest rates are so low, what happens is people want to believe in rosy future stories because they've accepted they can't get any yield today. So they say, well, don't worry about that. You're going to get yield in 50 years' time. And how you're going to do this is you're going to leverage yourself to these big tech companies. So all this is happening at the same time. And then suddenly it stops.
Right.
And suddenly it stops, right? As it has done in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
And all those deals are now unraveling, right? All those assumptions that Facebook or Google can continue to take huge parts of Dublin, but the same goes for any other major city around the world. San Francisco or Toronto or London, wherever, or Manchester, right? That's all stopped. Then the banks retrench. That's all stopped. Then the commercial property guys have to go back to the pension funds and say, listen, remember I told you I was going to give you a 4% yield, but in actual fact, it's going to be 1% yield, right? So the pension funds then go back to their people and say, your pension, all that sort of stuff. So it's all related. So everything. The problem is that we always think that there are borrowers and lenders, right?
Yeah.
But actual borrowers and lenders are interchangeable. Everybody's a borrower and everyone's a lender.
Right. Yeah. I know what you mean.
And so to go back to our story, the implication is, right, that everybody is sold down the river. Not just the slaves, not just the people who invested in the John Davis Bank of Arkansas in 1842, but the whole commercial property market falls at the same time. Why? Because everyone has been sold down the river.